Why it matters. Nintendo's greatest success versus Nintendo's greatest failures. Nintendo is on a hot streak. And as I've stated before, it's like a 20-year cycle. Things 20 years ago are popular once again. Things move in cycles. But Nintendo were not doing that great 20 years ago, believe it or not. 1998, the year where the N64, the Nintendo 64, was in a good 2-year cycle coming off the heels of the console wars. Nintendo had not celebrated victory over Sega yet, which meant the N64 had to do well, considering it was competing with the PlayStation as well. But why does it matter? Why does it matter that the Nintendo Switch is doing so well versus those previous failures, the N64, the Nintendo GameCube, and the Wii U? Today we will be discussing just that, and possibly the most important failure of all, the Virtual Boy as well. Heyo! Would you look at that? Nintendo seems to be selling out in gangbusters. It's just like the late 80s again. Good lord, all I want to do is play Zelda and figure out that frickin' tornado on Castlevania, man. Ah, man, the Nintendo hotline charged me $3.99 a minute for some hints and answers to these cryptic games, I swear. But it's not the 1980s again, it's 2018, and the Nintendo Switch is the fastest-selling console of all time. This wasn't always the case, though, because after arguably the best 8-bit and 16-bit consoles, Nintendo released the first venture into the 32-bit and 64-bit era of gaming, and that would be the Ultra 64. Well, that's what they originally called the prototype, but it's better known as the Nintendo 64. This was going to be amazing. We're talking about 2D side-scrolling adventures. They're basically the equivalent of looking at words on a piece of paper and turning them into a 3D world where you can enter and explore and look around and see everything. We were constantly teased with games like Star Fox, which had the Super FX enhanced chip, and we're even given glimpses of what 3D games could look like on the Nintendo with Star Fox. But they looked even better when the N64 came out. And it didn't disappoint Nintendo fans. We're talking 64-bit graphics, Mario and Zelda 64, and some of the most memorable games in video game history. But the Nintendo 64 was a failure. The Nintendo 64 was no failure, what are you talking about? Let me take you back a few years before the N64 to explain. Because of the next evolution in consoles, CD-based technology was all the rage at the time. It was a new era of technology, with PCs coming to use things like Windows 95 and these things called compact discs. These little discs could hold much more information than the standard cartridge or floppy disk even, meaning you could put 700 megabytes on them. And what that translated to past the bit wars was that you could basically put the equivalent of the NES and NES emulator and every Nintendo ROM onto a single compact disc. Yeah, that's the entire NES collection and an emulator add up to around 200 megabytes, giving you an additional 500 megabytes to spare. Now that's something, especially in the 90s. So, it was very clear that companies were seeking to break into the console wars, and they were wanting to not only jump into the 32-bit era, but also the 64-bit era, and use this new technology to do so. This would include the Philips CDI, a massively overpriced console with terrible CD-based games that often brought into question what games could be defined as. What was a game anymore? Then there was the Atari Jaguar, which through some extremely weird programming was an actual 64-bit console, and it had an add-on called the Jaguar CD, which made the console look like a toilet, so that was very fitting because it was such a crappy console. But one of the worst consoles was the 3DO, and it put the aforementioned Jaguar to shame, believe it or not. Being a CD-based console that was as expensive as they come, the 3DO was introduced as being a system that would completely destroy all other consoles in terms of technology. Well, we're playing the 3DO now, so that worked out great, right? That doesn't even include the Sega 32X, the Sega CD, and both the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis itself. This led Nintendo to not only create the Nintendo 64, but also work with Sony, whom was to create the CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. This was the assumed to be prototype, and until recently, we didn't even know what it really looked like, or what it was, or if it physically was what it had been drawn up to be, in which we have seen the real Super Nintendo PlayStation hybrid now. So it is a real thing. But because of Nintendo's unfortunate fear of Sony's control over the console, games, the shares, and the business deal, at the last moments, Nintendo pulled out and went with Philips, creating a deal where Philips CDI had published 3 Nintendo games, Hotel Mario, and 2 terrible Zelda CDI games. I assure you, there's some of the worst Nintendo games ever created. Now, why did all of this matter? Because it led Sony to possess the knowledge to create a CD-based console, which was called the PlayStation. After the deal failure between Sony and Nintendo, Sony was convinced to develop a console by utilizing their knowledge of both the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, creating the PlayStation. And would you look at that, the PlayStation is exactly the reason why the Nintendo 64 failed. Which is ironic because Nintendo unintentionally helped to create one of its biggest competition in the last 20 years. The PlayStation was subjectively better or worse than the N64 in terms of hardware, but as we see, the aforementioned more powerful consoles did not win the console wars for various reasons. The Sony PlayStation came out at a competitive price and natively supported CDs during a time where CD players were quite expensive and in demand. This PlayStation sold more than 3 times the Nintendo 64, being a non-established newcomer to the console wars. Games were very limited on the N64, which caused a massive shift of developers to move over to the PlayStation, as they saw how easy it was to develop for that console, to have uncompressed textures, music, audio, to have so much more extra room. Those developers didn't have to use so many programming tricks to fit the games onto the cartridges anymore. They could just use CDs. Nintendo didn't want to slow load times, Nintendo were afraid of piracy with CD copying processes, and yeah, that was a big thing at the time, but this all culminated to them using cartridges. The next 10 years would see Sony as the king of consoles, and it was all because Nintendo was too afraid, too worried about the potentials, backing out of deals, creating terrible consoles, and then moving with trends too late. I mean, VR was all the rage at one point in time. They threw together a virtual console headset to compete with the potential 32X coming out, the Sega 32X, and then it wasn't even fully complete. It was just like a beta prototype, and they stuck it on the shelves, and hey, would you look at that? It was one of the worst consoles ever created, the Virtual Boy, and it killed VR for a lot of people. After years of being established, the PlayStation 2 did end up coming out, and once again, it was one of the least powerful devices available between the Nintendo, GameCube, and the Xbox, the PlayStation 2. And once again, Nintendo moves with the market, changing over to discs, and making one of the most powerful consoles, yet losing again to the Sony PlayStation 2. Why? This time for the same reason, fear of using DVDs, and instead using mini discs to help mitigate piracy. Which also meant that the GameCube didn't have a built-in DVD player this time, where the entire market was shifting to DVDs from VHS. So yeah, you kind of missed the ship there, Nintendo. But both Sony and Xbox had DVD support, with Sony being native, not requiring any purchase whatsoever, and the newcomer Xbox requiring the purchase of a remote, a very small entry fee to get yourself a DVD player. Even with the Dreamcast, they had native support for CDs at least, making a nice music console when the CD players were still really expensive. So once more, because Nintendo were too afraid and too late to the party, the competition destroyed them, creating the best-selling console of all time, the PlayStation 2. And this caused Nintendo to rethink things. They started looking, they started realizing the Wii was the paradigm shift. It was the smallest, weakest console of the generation, yet the most sought after and one of the best-selling consoles ever. In comparison with the PlayStation 3 lost significantly, even though it was more powerful. And it was basically the most powerful console of the generation itself. And it had tons of extra features like a Blu-ray player. Being off the heels of the PlayStation 2 didn't even save it and allow it to just ride on the coattails of the PlayStation 2 to victory. It nearly had half of its sales of its predecessor. This then encouraged Nintendo to move into more unique trends, rather than the conventional ones, as it saw its previous failures, which culminated to the creation of the Wii U, a strange mobile hybrid console which was restricted to home use only. This was arguably poorly marketed. It used PowerPC architecture, making it extremely difficult to program in comparison to the other two consoles, and it was underpowered in comparison to the competition. Once again, third-party developers weren't ready to return. Nintendo saw the wave of small computers, the tablet PCs, the netbooks, the phones, and jumped aboard, but failed to realize that there was something known as the rise of online gaming. And now, we sit on the cusp of change once more, where the PlayStation 4 has dominated once more for several years, and Nintendo are coming back with a complete shift in paradigm again. Nintendo didn't develop the most powerful console with the biggest storage and the best graphics and the most conventional features built in. Nintendo developed a console that anyone could buy, pick up, and instantly play, which has appeal to it, and it appeals to people who have extremely low patience for load times because now it uses cartridges, and are constantly busy and on the move, and want a console for home use. So it's the perfect console for casual individuals and hardcore Nintendo fans. That's why it matters, because Nintendo have come back from their most massive failures to become the fastest selling console ever in the last 40 years of console manufacturing. Why it matters is that what Nintendo says is true. Everyone wants 4K Super Mario on the most powerful system ever, but would that really separate from the competition? Why would you buy a Nintendo console if it did the same exact thing as the other two? If you already own a PlayStation or an Xbox, why would you buy a Nintendo console that did the same exact thing, but had some exclusives on it? Especially if you didn't even care or play those exclusives. Nintendo would once again lose this console war generation if they went with conventional trends instead of thinking outside the box, and that's why it matters. Why it matters, ladies and gentlemen, is because without Nintendo, consoles would be no different than just variations of PCs, and consoles would be all the same. We already see it with Sony, we already see it with Microsoft, and both are doing the same things pretty much to a T, minus a very select few exclusives and design choices. So, if you enjoyed this episode of Why It Matters, please leave me a big thumbs up, like and share this video, and help educate some of our fellow gaming brethren about some video game history, ladies and gentlemen. I've been your host, Protomario, and I'm signing out. As always, good gaming, God bless, and thanks for taking the time out to watch this video.